Okay, we're going to begin tonight starting in the book of Exodus. Now, let me just fill you back in where we were. Remember, we were studying, first of all, back in our chronological study of Genesis to start it all out. And then I went to the end of all things in the book of Revelation. And so we studied through all the book of Revelation. So in the Bible, we sort of got the bookends there. How it all began, in the book of Revelation, how it all comes together at the end. And in between is the whole story of man and the Savior, and sin, and all the things that happened in between this time. We're going to be looking in the book of Exodus, but let me just review. It's been a little while since we've been in the book of Genesis, and remember that the book of Genesis, to remember how it's laid out, remember chapters 1 through 11 is one section, and remember there were 4 C's that we talked about there that described that section. Anyone remember what the 4 C's were? How about the first one? Creation, the creation of all things. And we looked at that, how God created the world universe. And then the second thing was what? Anyone remember that second C? Damnation. Well, corruption, sin. The sin entered the picture in Genesis 3. And that's the corruption of all things. And the Bible described, but why is this such a mess? Well, Genesis 3 tells us how that started and where we went from there. And then the next C, anybody remember what that is? The next big event in the Bible after that? Creation. No, that was the first thing, but it was Noah's flood. We call it the condemnation of all things. The condemnation. God destroyed this earth the way it was. And you remember, as Peter talked about, how the earth that was perished. And so that we don't have the earth we have on today is nothing like the original creation. It all went underwater. It all reformed. It all changed. And all the strange things we see in this creation, you know, as I enjoy watching some of the things on television, some of the things, different archaeological things and all that kind of stuff, and they see some of these strange landmarks, you know, and they have this thing out there west, Devil's Tower. Did you ever see that thing? It sticks straight up. It's a big rock. Did you ever see that on television? Anybody see that? It's out west there somewhere, one of the states. But it's just a huge rock. And of course, there's all these legends of how it got there and why it's just one big rock sticking up. Well, you know, those of us who believe in the flood, all that stuff out there was formed during the flood. I mean, the earth was moving, and all this water was carrying stuff out, and that's the reason the Grand Canyon's out there the way it looks, and these big old things sticking up out there don't make any sense, and all that. It all came after the result of the flood. The flood left everything, even a little local flood. You understand what it changes to the landscape. Could you imagine what a flood that would cover the entire earth? It would totally change everything and make things look very strange after everything dried out. So that was a condemnation of everything. And then the final C there in chapters 1 through 11, anyone remember about that final one? It has to do with the Tower of Babel. Confusion of all things. Remember at the Tower of Babel, the languages? Why did God do that? Well, He told them to disperse throughout the earth, and people under Nimrod, and remember how we looked there under this original Babylon group, this Babylonian. Babylon has to do with Babel. And so mankind was trying to build their own way to God and trying to do their own thing, and God set in with a confusion of languages, and people just dispersed in different parts of the world. It was the confusion of all things. So Genesis 1 through 11 has those 4 C's to remember how it's put together. And then starting in Genesis 12, we have what's called the patriarchal stage of the Scriptures. And this was how God was now beginning to form a nation that He would use to bring us the Word and the Messiah. And that's very important for us in the Old Testament story, is how God was bringing that apart. Now, what was 4? There was 4 basically main patriarchs that we looked at in the book of Genesis. Who was the first one? Abraham, yeah, Genesis chapter 12. That was the father of the nation of Israel. And then he had a son that he waited a long time for. Who was that? Isaac. Isaac was there then Isaac had some kids. He had twins, and who were they? Jacob and Esau. And Jacob was the one that God was going to use in the line of the Messiah. Then Jacob had all these 12 sons, and the one son that the book of Genesis spends a lot of time on was who? Joseph. And so Joseph then becomes one of the main characters of the book of Genesis. And actually, from about chapter 37 to 50 is all about Joseph and his life and what God was doing. And that took us to the end of the book of Genesis, when the nation of Israel, which was 70 people at that time, Abraham's descendants were 70 people. Remember, after the miraculous work with God bringing Joseph through very unusual means down to Egypt, and if you was just reading that story along and not seeing how it was going to turn out, you think, well, God, what are you doing to this poor guy? Well, he was causing him to be in the right place at the right time, and he was able to guide his family so they wouldn't starve to death during the great famine. So Jacob literally moved his family later on down to Egypt. Joseph now had become like second in command under the Pharaoh, and so we see when Genesis, goes off, the nation of Israel under with Joseph there leading, was down there in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and then it goes off. Now what happened then is about 400 years from the time the Israelites came there till we get to the book of Exodus. And during that time, some bad things began to happen to these Hebrews. And so, although at first it was all really good for the nation of Israel, they got down into Egypt where there was food, and they was miraculously given some good land where they was able to raise their crops and raise their animals and all that kind of stuff. And the nation began to multiply with lots of people. And then after a few hundred years, things began to change politically. In fact, they had a Pharaoh rise up who didn't know all this big story about Joseph and didn't care about all that Hebrew people. In fact, the only thing he did is he saw the Hebrew children as a possible threat to his kingdom, because what would happen if they would be join the enemy and come out against them. So things began to change there before God brings them back into the land. And so the book of Exodus picks us up long after Joseph died. The children of Israel then in this land of Egypt with a Pharaoh who did not know anything about it, did not care. And so we're going to pick that up, and we're going to be looking through here about their persecution. First of all, the reason for this persecution is Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. Now, the first few verses of Exodus 1 has to deal a little bit of the lineage of Jacob and his children there. But we'll pick up in verse 6. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all of that generation. Okay, like I was just telling you, that one sentence there sort of fills in a lot of time there. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, that the land was filled with them. Okay, that's amazing there that this group went from 70, and in about 400 years, they were probably a group of at least 2 million people. So in about 400 years, which is a long time, you figure how many people was in the United States of America 400 years ago. Well, there wasn't that many people in Jamestown. I remember when they first landed over there. And now we got 300 million people. So, you can understand how population increases and all that kind of stuff. And so this is what happened there. And there rose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply and come to pass that when we fall out in war, and join us into our enemies and fight against us and get them out of the land. So here's this group who was now going to be persecuted because the king feared that they may join up with an enemy. So for a long time, things were good for them. Goshen was a beautiful land for them to raise their animals. It was there in the Nile Basin, and they had good land and good feed and all this stuff. And boy, they were blossoming. And so here it was, just when everything looked good, everything goes bad. Sometimes we find that in the Scripture. God tells us a story when everything goes good and some things go bad. But in that, there was something good going to come out of that. Now, we're going to see what was the results of that persecution there. First of all, he began a construction. Pharaoh decided to use his people as slaves. So the slavery period begins with harsh treatment. Pharaoh's decree was, therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Now, that's sort of amazing how God's hand was on the nation of Israel. In slavery, with harshness, they were multiplying and doing better. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage and mortar and brick and all manner of service in the field. All their service there, and they made them was with rigor. So the Pharaoh was tightening the grips on them. And, he was going to, if he was going to have them in the land, he was going to cause them much pain. Let me show you a little bit of where they're. Maybe understand a little bit where they're at. Where do we go to there? There it is. There's a little map of that area there. You see where Pithom and Ramses is and Goshen. Okay, that's where the children of Israel were at. And that's in the Nile Basin there and all that beautiful land. And this was where they were going to build these cities. The Egyptians were builders. You know that. They built great cities. They built great monuments. They built big things. And so they did it on the backs of slaves, though. They didn't have their own workforce. They used the slaves. And they had a good army. They forced this work done. And so you see there a little bit where that was, so you get an understanding. Later on, we'll look at this, how they left that land and went into the Sinai Peninsula. And then he not only was this idea of using them for construction, he began to have a bloody decree. And he said, when you do office of a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. And if it be a daughter, then you shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. So this Pharaoh, he was getting very insecure, and he was saying, man, we don't even want if these kids keep having boys, they'll grow up to be men, and they'll be soldiers, and they'll come and get us. And he had these women to kill, he told them to kill these little children. Now, fortunately here, a lot of these women, well, we're not going to kill these people. We fear God. We're not going to be murderers for your sake. And so then he ordered to the mass, and Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. And so he sent out the order to his people. They were casting babies alive into the river. That's how far and pagan these people were. They didn't care anything about the life of these children. But but how much does people in this world still care that way, isn't it? You know how many millions has been aborted in America just because it wasn't convenient to have them. Before you get too hard on the pharaohs there of this land is no different from the leaders of our land who say, hey, if you don't like this child, just murder it. Don't have the child. A wicked heart is a wicked heart, no matter how you put it. And that's what we see today. And Pharaoh was just the same way. So let's see the next step here. This next part here is in Exodus chapter 2. And we're going to see the introduction to Moses. And Moses comes on the scene. Moses becomes one of the most important people of the Bible. In fact, Moses, we know, actually wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He probably did it sometime, most of it in the 40 years that they were in the wilderness, and they had plenty of writing time, I guess. And he wrote the book of Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy. And so this is called the books of the law, if you want to know how it's classified, because it gives the first laws to the nation of Israel and the foundation for so much of the Christian faith and so much things. So Moses is going to come on the scene. And he's born into this time of this difficulty. He's born in this time of adversity. He's born in a time where there was this paganism of hatred for these people. So let's look here a little bit at this. We'll look at some of these scriptures. And there was went a man of the house of Levi and took a wife, the daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that she was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took him from an ark of bulrushes and dabbed it with the slime of the pitch and put the children therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river banks. And so we know the story how, the godly parents, and that's what, in Hebrews chapter 11 that describes back the story of this, he said they were godly people, God-fearing people. And they looked at their child and they believed that God could rescue this child. And so they put a plan together. They put a plan to save his child. And God was going to use this person here to be a deliverer for the nation of Israel. And so the plan. They hid the baby as long as they could, and then they decided that they would probably better get it to the point that one of the people could rescue the baby. And so they put it there. Let me see if we can read some of these verses here. Starting in verse 5. They put the baby down where the Pharaoh's daughter would be able to find it. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. And her maidens walked along by the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the figs, she sent her maid to fetch it. Evidently, they must have done a little reconnaissance work. They probably not this daughter of Pharaoh was probably a good person. They probably figured out that this daughter would probably save this child. There must have been some reason they did it. They had it all set up. And of course, we know that these people know Moses' parents. I know they prayed about it. They sought the Lord's wisdom about it. And the Lord gave him this plan. And when she opened up, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept, and she had compassion on him. She said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Now, some people in the Pharaoh's household would have found them, would have killed this little male child immediately. But here this person had compassion. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse to the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the children for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went out and called the child's mother. So it worked out that let me go find someone to nurse his baby. And they found Moses' mother there. And not only did she get to take care of baby Moses, she got paid for it. So this is how God did his will in this picture here. And we did know later then that Moses then was going to grow up in the palace of Pharaoh. So he grew up with being educated. He grew up with much wealth, and so the Bible doesn't tell a lot about that time, but you know that he would have had access to so much things there as Pharaoh's actually sort of like a son to Pharaoh, and so there he was in the palace. So what was he going to do now? The Bible doesn't tell a lot of details about Moses' life during those years, but we do. The next picture we see him is really after he grows up. And he's probably close to 40 years old when we see him in his next scene. So we see baby Moses, and remember his name Moses too. His name because he was drawn out. He was drawn out of the Nile River, and so he got that name. That's where the name Moses was. So this one who was drawn out now is an adult, and he realizes his heritage. Moses could have been a person who said, "I don't want to get involved with his people. I've got life really good in my palace. I've got a plush life here." If he was living today, say, "I've got fancy sport cars. I've got big screen TVs. I've got it all." And he said, "Boy, I don't want to rock the boat to lose all this." But Moses, God had put in his heart to know that he wasn't saved where all the other male children was losing their lives for no reason at all. He knew there was a purpose. Moses understood that God had him there for some reason. Now, at first, Moses sort of gets ahead of God. He just sort of, man, I've got to do something. Well, you can't blame Moses for that. I mean, he saw his people being under harsh slavery and being mistreated, and so he decides, I'm going to jump in. I've got a little bit of authority. So when we get into this chapter here, verse 11, he says, "And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens and spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And so, I'm not going to let this Egyptian. Now, he grew up with Egyptians. He grew up in the house of Egyptians, but he knew that wasn't right for this Egyptian to be beating one of these Hebrew people. Now, unfortunately, God hadn't told him to do this kind of work. Sometimes we think something may be good, but God didn't tell us to do it. It wasn't of God's will. God's will wasn't for him to do it this way, and people found out about it. And when he was out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together, and these 2 Hebrews was fighting with one another. And he said to them that did wrong, wherefore smitest thou the fellow? Why are you fighting this people, what he's saying? And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? He knew that it was what he did was something that people knew about. And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. This is an interesting part here. Now, here was Moses, who was grown up as a son of this person, really as a family member. But this thing really set Pharaoh off in the wrong way. Now, the Bible doesn't give us all the details of what was going on there. What did Moses do? Well, I know that he must have really he tried to stand up against Pharaoh for his mishandling these people. Because we know what Hebrews tells us in chapter 11, the reason he left. He left because he felt that it wasn't the will of God. He said, I would rather suffer from the reproaches of Christ than to enjoy the pleasures of sin in Egypt. So he left because he decided, I'm not going to side with the Father. I know he probably could have made things amended. He had very much power. He could have said, Dad, I'm sorry I did this. I don't want to kill anymore and all this kind of stuff. And I'll walk the line. I'll be a good Egyptian. Evidently, that didn't happen. He said, no, this is wrong. You can't treat these people this way. And Pharaoh was angered at him and ran him out of the country. And so Moses, at age 40, now has to leave Egypt. And so when we're reading the story, now the hero is gone. He's out of the picture. And we're thinking, well, why did God, if you don't know the whole story, well, why did God miraculously save this young man to literally grow up and to be kicked out? Well, God had a plan. Romans 8:28 says all things work together for good to those who love God, because God was sending him away to send him to his school. You see, Moses went to Pharaoh's school, and Pharaoh understood all about the things of the world, but he needed to go to God's school. Now, God's school wasn't located in Egypt. It was located in the desert. And so Pharaoh leaves the land, and we'll pick it up there in chapter 2. And he comes across this desert to this well, and he meets in the land of Midian. And he actually, here's Moses though. He just can't. He has to get involved. He's a leader of action. When this Egyptian was beating up the Hebrew, he stepped in. When these 2 Hebrews were fighting against this, he stepped in. Something about a leader like that he has to get involved. Where he comes to this place, and these women were being mistreated, and he steps up for them. He says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock, and the shepherds came and drove them away. Some other shepherds said, you get out of here. This is our time at the well. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Here's Moses standing up for people again. You see, God was going to use him because he was willing to stand up for people. He was willing to take a stand. He was willing to take a risk. And it becomes to the point here that Moses, it says that Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses to Zipporah his daughter. So he actually finds a wife during this time. So he gets married to this woman, and it begins a family there in Midian. It was interesting, a little side note, that Dr. Wilmington put in here, that both Moses and Zipporah were descendants of Abraham. Moses through Sarah, and she through Keturah. So that's sort of interesting side note. After Sarah died, Abraham married Keturah, and so there was, a different line of people, but they were both in the line of Abraham, and that was sort of interesting. And so now we see Moses there in Midian. Now here's a 40-year-old guy. He was. Let's say he'd been educated. He had wealth, and it's all behind him now. And now he was living over as a shepherd. And he lived out in the desert. He took care of sheep. That was his life for many years. And so the next time we see Moses, another 40 years basically has passed. And he's had all these years as being a sheep herder. But this was God's school that he had him on. God was teaching him humility. God was teaching him patience. God was teaching him that he had to depend on him. And then eventually God was going to say, now Moses, I'm going to show you what I saved your life for back here years ago. So let me at least introduce this next section, probably one of the most famous stories in the Bible, the story of the burning bush. Okay, this is now when God is going to come head to head right with Moses. Okay, we don't have a lot of stories that how God had talked to Moses or any direct communication at all, but we do know that's now God has stepped in. God is patient. He waited 80 years to really talk to his man. Sometimes we can't wait 80 minutes to talk to somebody. We can't wait any time, but God waited 80 years now for Moses. And let's read that. It starts in chapter 3 there, a little few verses. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And so seeing things on fire was not unusual in the desert, all that dry stuff. Sometimes things would catch a fire. But this was burning, but it wasn't burning up. He said, this is not the usual thing. This is something that, I'm going to investigate. And when he goes to investigate, he finds that this was something miraculous. God was going to speak to him now. His life now, all the 80 years of his life was coming to this important moment. God was meeting with him face to face. And these verses in Exodus chapter there, let me just read some of these verses here. Here, first of all, in verse 5. When Moses went up to the burning bush, he said, draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, from the place where thou standest is holy ground. Okay, the idea of getting your shoes off was the respect and reverence from where you're at. You're in the midst of a holy God. You see, Moses grew up in a land of a nation that had all kinds of gods, but they weren't a holy God. Holy means a purity God, a purified God, an absolute sinless, no defilement in him. You see, God is he's without any stain, without any sin. And it's like, if somebody had beautiful white carpet in their house, you wouldn't just walk through the carpet on a bunch of old dirty shoes on. It just wouldn't be right, would it? And he was just like, I'm in the presence of a holy God. And he said, take your shoes off. You gotta, anytime we're with God, it's a holy place. There needs to be some respect for God. And sometimes we don't see respect for God. There needs to be a reverence for God. When we talk about God, we ought to be talking to him with respect and reverence. Don't you dare even use the name of God unless you're using it in a reverence way. Some people use the name of God and use it as a swear word, a slang word, and all kinds of stuff. Hey, you're like Moses. You're in the presence of a pure, holy one. Don't ever forget that. And Moses here was now going to be with God. Let me get down here another one of these verses here. Verse 8, and I'm come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Basically, God had said, I'd heard their cry. I've heard their groanings. You know, the nation of Israel there, they didn't understand everything back in Egypt. They began to cry out to God, and the God of their forefather Abraham, and would God deliver us? Now you got to remember, the Egyptian experience was told to Abraham many years before that there would be a time away from the land of Canaan. You see, that land in that time of the slavery was not to be just say, well, God made a big mistake. God had a purpose for that too. God was going to teach them that He's going to be their deliverer. You know, just like, Egypt, is a picture for us as Christians. Egypt is sort of pictures our old life as a sinner. And before we're saved, we're all like the Hebrews down in Egypt. We're all down in slavery. Our slavery is to the taskmaster of sin. And just as Moses would be the one that goes back and delivers them out, the Bible says our New Testament understands Jesus is the one who came and delivers us out of the bondages of sin. Throughout the Bible, then, that was a picture of the Christian and the believer getting saved and coming out of the life of bondages, out of the life of sin. So this wasn't a waste of time for the nation of Israel. God was allowing this difficult time to come to teach a bigger picture, a bigger lesson, that who God is, who He is, and what's He all about. So He said, I'm come down to deliver them out of the land of Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good land, a large, into a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So God says, my plan is I'm going to go bring them out of there. I'm going to take them back out. He says, come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. One of the little side things about this is, at first when he was meeting with God in this holy place, he said, take your shoes off and worship here and listen. But then there was action to be taking place. This is basically Moses, put your shoes back on and do the work. You see, we as Christians, there's times that we've got to take our shoes off and worship the Lord. You may come to the altar and you may be praying. You may be searching God and seeking God. But in the Christian life is also put your shoes back on and do the work of the ministry. Serve the Lord. We can't... God doesn't expect us to walk with our shoes off. He expects us to walk with our shoes on, serving Him. And so that's what Moses was going to have to do. And so God set the order down. He says, Moses, you're the man. If God came after him, Moses wasn't looking. He would have been just content to finish his life out there as a sheep herder in the land of Midian. He didn't have any problem with it. He was a contented man. He had a family. He had it all going off. He was nice and everything going well. And then God steps in and says, I want you to go back and get these people. That's quite a tall order. I want you to go back into the one that you left, the one that you caused quite a stir with, this powerful group of people that can control the known world at that time. I want you to go back, and you're going to demand that they let the people go, and you're going to take them out of that land, and you're going to take them back into a land which happens to be occupied by a lot of wicked people. And we're going to get to that point later, he tells Moses. But I'm going to take you back to there, and you're going to have that land that I promised to your forefathers Abraham. That was what they were supposed to do. And so God knocked on his door, intervened, and gave him the marching orders. God still knocks on people's doors and says, listen, I want you to get busy doing this. I want you to get busy serving the Lord. I'm hoping we have some young people in our church that will listen to God. I'm hoping we have some young people in our church that if God comes knocking at my door or your door and says, I want to use you for my glory, are you willing to submit to the Lord? Are you willing to say, yes, God? Next week we'll get into some of Moses at first had a lot of excuses, but God says, no excuses taken. I'm going to use you. Okay? And I hope we have people in our church that says when God knocks on your door, maybe God's going to knock on your door and says, I want you to get involved with this ministry. I want you to get involved doing this at our church in this town of Buchanan. I want you to do this. The Holy Spirit we talked about this morning, He communes with us. When the Holy Spirit knocks on your door of your heart and says, I want you to be involved with this, don't be telling God that you don't have time. Don't be telling God that you can't do that. Don't be telling God you don't have the abilities. Don't be telling God that you don't. If God wouldn't have knocked on your door if He didn't think He could do it. God would have knocked on your door and said, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that you couldn't do that. No, God didn't do that. If God knocks on the door of your heart and wants you to do something, He knows that you can do it. Because He'll provide the wisdom, the power, and the strength. Just like He was going to do with Moses. I don't care what age you are, you can be used for God in something in the church. Moses was a man who was 80 years old. And God was going to give him the greatest mission of his life, to do the greatest work the Bible probably ever had, to set up a nation of Israel for His people, that one day would bring the Word of God and the Messiah to all the world. What a great opportunity he was going to have. And next time we'll look at some of Moses' response to this and what was the outcome of this.